Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Politics can be oversimplified as the ideations which influence management and administration through a government entity. This succinct definition seems right when we consider how politics influences government to provide services, infrastructure, tax revenue, and the like. However, it is a bit uncomfortable when we consider politics as responsible for managing and administering life and death. The idea seems macabre and incongruous. But for most of human history, there was no need for such a role. The pregnant gave birth, the elderly died, and little could be done to combat the violence life visited upon us through warfare, accident, or disease. The rise of modern advances in science, particularly medicine, has ushered in an age where life and death are something to be managed and administered. Today, we're discussing biopolitics. So this is going to be a difficult but important episode, and I'm sure there are going to be people that are going to strongly disagree with some things that we say and strongly agree with them.
Probably.
So, of course, we'll try to remain as objective as possible, but sometimes being objective isn't necessarily the same as taking a position that people might consider neutral.
No.
So we'll go through it. I think we'll start with, what is biopolitics?
Well, biopolitics was an idea developed by a philosopher we have talked about or alluded to sometimes. Not entirely talked about, I think, Michel Foucault, who affected in the mid-20th century, into the last third of the 20th century, all kinds of fields, from criminal justice all the way into neuroscience. He was that kind of philosopher. And one of the things he talked about was biopolitics. And he says this refers to the humanitarian values that deal with the political relations between the administration or regulation of the life of species and a locality's populations. So it's about where politics intersects. Part of it's about where politics intersects with what we would now call eco studies, the environment, climate. Part of it is about what do governments do and what do collectives of people do to administrate and maintain ideas of their own health. And then where that gets even more complicated than it already sounds is a thing called necropolitics, which is discussed brilliantly. It's essentially been put forward by first a French philosopher named Frantz Fanon, and then a gentleman from Cameroon named Achille Membi, who's written now 3 books, sort of a trilogy of philosophy for surviving this century. A hopeful set of books. We can still make ourselves better, because necropolitics is the opposite side of the coin of biopolitics. So necropolitics is how governments, societies make decisions in their own for their own benefit, knowing full well that it's going to cast other populations into great distress, and even to a point which he calls the walking dead. So I think it would be hard. Somebody who doesn't want to hear this necessarily, but it would be hard to push back much against the idea that decisions by populations affect climate. Decisions by populations affect other populations. We don't like to think of that much, and a lot of that on the probably ground level hasn't been considered a whole lot, other than by indigenous populations. And so that's where it starts.
Yeah. And so, we don't want to diminish anybody's contributions, but I'll probably use the term biopolitics just for simplicity's sake
Sure.
to talk about the whole thing.
Sure.
But necropolitics is a big part of it. Like you said, it's the other side of that coin. Yeah, I'm reading a book right now. It's very interesting called Power Trip, and it's about essentially the history of energy and energy in all of its forms. Right, going back, they talk about water. How water has been used throughout history as a source of energy. How food is a source of energy. How wealth is a source of energy. Electricity. All of these different concepts. Really fascinating book. That just goes through the history of how these things developed and how they contribute to human society. And it gives you this really keen insight into how we're affecting the environment and how our use of resources has impacted the development of the species. Mm-hmm. And that is a huge part of biopolitics that we'll be discussing today.
Yes.
So is there a history of biopolitics before modern times? Had philosophers considered this before Michel Foucault?
Not as such. I mean, there's political philosophy that goes way back. And of course, Plato talks about the responsibilities of a state and citizens and people all the way up through, like last week we were talking about Rousseau. But they weren't talking about the idea of life itself in the same ways that we are conceiving of it now.
Do you think that is because of modern advances in medicine?
I do.
Like I said in the intro, because you look at like the historical statistics, right? And you say, okay, the average life expectancy was to age 40 or 50 until about 100 years ago. I mean, and if you think about it, that's really recently in history. So, and of course, a lot of that's taken into account infant mortality, childhood illness. If you were able to survive childhood, you generally had a pretty decent long life into your late 60s or 80s.
Yeah, with the 60s, 70s, 80s was not uncommon in much of history. But in the overall view, there was a lot of loss.
And so, in that way, it was more sort of, philosophers didn't consider it much because nature just kind of took its course. You didn't really have much. It fascinates me today. I think about it a lot. Just as for a simple example, a guy in my work who's a couple years younger than me had a hernia and had to have surgery, and it was a very bad hernia. The doctor said that he had to have it fixed right away, or it was in very bad shape. Yeah. So he had the surgery, and then he couldn't lift anything for like 2 weeks, and then after that was completely fine. And I thought, imagine if that same injury had occurred 200 years ago, right? In the age of 20, you're 26 or 27, whatever, you'd be dead, something that simple. And, now 2 weeks after it happened, you don't even think about it. It doesn't occur to you. Yep. And there's a lot of things like that occur. You think about, your appendicitis or your appendectomies and those are big things, but even down to fevers and ear infections and simple things that we just don't even really consider nowadays are things that killed people before, right. And
right.
That was
and
just part
it's
of
transparent, isn't it? And this is, so you take the prefix bio and you put it to pretty much anything in philosophical terms, and you're talking about enlightenment or post-enlightenment for the past few hundred years. Because we just assume this, but this is what the difficulty that both Membe and Foucault and Fanon were talking about is that we're in a situation in which, when there's a development, for just medicine as one example, since we're on the topic, there's a development, people all want to have access to it. But everybody's not going to have access to it. That depends on all kinds of complications, such as insurance and all the attempts that people have tried to voice about simplifying insurance, and there's a lot of pushback about that. But yet people want what's there. At the same time, that a lot of people know that they're not going to have access to it if they don't have the means. So that's where the biopolitics comes in, and yet another way, in the sense of a society uh, regulating itself in one way or another, putting its imperatives, its what's important to it. But it's not about equitability. It's, I think there's a recognition built into it that it's not that way. And capitalism certainly isn't going to do that. But I'm not just going to bash on capitalism. There's really no system that we know of functionally in our current time, in a large nation state that does a grand job of that. Now, I'm not trying to be relativistic because there are different levels, but pretty much there's not an equal distribution of resources anywhere on the planet.
Yeah, yeah. So, what are some biopolitical issues surrounding birth?
Well, biopolitical issues surrounding birth would be what kind of care should the person giving birth receive? Are there systems in place that will ascertain and make certain that mothers have a reasonable chance of having a healthy delivery? And we know in our country, we have one of the highest maternal death rates of a child, which is almost inexplicable to people, except biopolitics would say, well, it is explicable because, or the opposite side of the coin, necropolitics would, because clearly you're not equalizing the concern for all populations. And so some get very little, some get a lot. So we've talked about with education, but this turns into being a mortal issue for a mother or a baby. But you can also look at it at the same time as you're just talking about your colleague. Perhaps has the kind of insurance that would have helped, has access to the doctors who would do it immediately. If we were living in a really remote place and not part of a great big medical system, that might have gone differently. And so biopolitics gets into the conversation about what do we accept as good enough and where are our priorities.
Yeah, and this is I was listening to an interesting interview this week with a guy talking about scientists, right? And he was saying, what a lot of people don't think about is that science is done by scientists, right? So, and in a lot of ways, scientists are more like children than the rest of the population. They're more curious and they're more, inquisitive and stuff, but they also can be very prideful and they can be very self-absorbed in some of these other things. And so, they're people, right? They have flaws, right? And when you think about that, and you all of a sudden you realize, okay, well, we have, even if we had standardized programs, right? So we have requirements. Here's what's required to be a doctor, whether it's a medical doctor or whatever. So these are the requirements, but different schools are going to have different standards of training and education, which some might be inferior to others. Different doctors as individuals may have, either superior or substandard qualities in terms of how they are able to
treat a very patients. Complicated mix.
Yeah. And most importantly, and I think this is an important biopolitical, why can't I say that word? Biopolitical issue heading into the future that we've talked about is as the U.S. population decreases, right? The decrease of population results in an aging population, which results in a shrinking workforce. So access to medical doctors is going to be restricted pretty much across the board. But like the example that you brought up, where in remote areas, it's going to be much harder to get a doctor, right? If you have somebody who's very qualified and can make a lot of money, chances are they're not going to want to be out in the middle of rural Montana where they have access to nothing, right?
Yeah.
Well, the competition for these doctors is going to get more and more, strict, right?
Right.
And so the more rural the population you live in, the higher the chances are that you're not going to have access to that same level of medical care. And we might see a decrease in care that the medical system provides.
Yes.
As it goes.
And it may be that population's choice. And this is where it gets really messy. And this is why some people may be upset. I hope not, because I hope, as always, we are having a civil, fun discussion. Because even though you're talking about very, very, very serious things, you still enjoy discussing it. It's when you can't discuss it anymore that things get grim. But there are parts of populations. The rural politics is not always urban politics in terms of how cities decide to do things, and that's just one factor. And the other thing we have to remember is we've come out of probably the largest biopolitical situation that has ever occurred globally, and that certainly was COVID. And so when biopolitics means the intersecting of government, life, and politics, of a mutual relationship between them, and they're incorporated together. And when what's being determined is the priorities for the life of the population. I don't think it's not vile to say this. We messed up badly on the scale of the resources that we have. There's a huge report that just came out this past week about this. We lost well over 1 million people. They were not prioritized because systems had not been maintained and kept in place. And fresh systems that could deliver help were rejected. And that was a messy but mutual decision among smaller clusters of the population that affected the health of the entire population. And so it was biopolitical in the most, I think, obvious sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a good opportunity to ask probably the messiest question, right? Because we're talking about the biopolitics of birth, and now we've brought COVID into it. And this is a question that I saw asked a lot during that pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Usually by people with a right-leaning political view. And it's a legitimate question, right? Which is my body, my choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the argument is that, well, people who have left-leaning politics and support abortion policies can say, it's my body, it's my choice to have an abortion.
Yep.
And people who are right-leaning will say, it's my body, it's my choice whether or not I get a vaccination, right? Do both of those people have that same right based off of that same argument?
Well, they certainly have that right. That's one of the grand things about any Western democracy. You have, it's not just the United States where people can say anything that they want to. It's pretty much over Western democracies. We don't have a corner on that market. So of course they have the right. It's a matter of thinking through the ramifications of that asserted choice.
This is a great example of applied philosophy, right? People having to use critical thinking in order to go through their position.
Exactly so. So I'll stumble all over this, but in we go. You have if you have the right of choice, and you assert that in all instances you have the right of choice, nobody on the right and some on the left wouldn't agree with that. Because when people assert that they have the right to tell you what to do with your body, and it's about their own life choices that have no effect on the rest of the population, that is fundamentally different than making a choice that could have a very deleterious effect on the population.
Yeah, so this is essentially this is kind of utilitarianism, sort of in this way, right? So with the COVID vaccine, it's the kind of thing where, And of course, this is another thing that gets brought up a lot, right? Well, first they were saying this, now they're saying this, now they're saying this. And there was a good reason for that. It's because we had never seen a virus on this scale like
manifesting
this,
it as it was.
So there's a high degree of what we've discussed in the past, verisimilitude, right? And the process of science, right? Science is not rock solid facts. It's the process of obtaining knowledge, right? So early on, there was no knowledge. And so we're operating off the best things that we had based off of previous models, based off of early data. And then as the pandemic went on, the information got better and better until now we have a pretty good idea of what was going on. And as a matter of fact, there might even be a virus for all coronaviruses at some point. And a lot of good scientific advancements have come out.
Sure.
But no, like you're saying, there's a lot of reports now with the information we have that says, well, you know what, if everybody had followed the advice that was given at the time, like you said, we would have saved.
Everyone wouldn't have been saved.
Right.
But there would have been less loss of life.
Right. Whereas with an abortion scenario, like you said, now it's one person with their body. Now, with a right-leaning stance, what you're saying is that the child is also a person and that person is losing their life. And now if you extrapolate that to a large scale, you are still losing a lot of people. But none of the individual's actions influence the other individual's actions in the ecosystem necessarily.
Yes, you're looking into a future sense. Also, you have to have strenuous debate about what the word child means, because a child is somebody who has emerged.
Right. It's extremely philosophical.
Yeah, right. So all of that's packed in there. And we're not here to try to solve that debate, but the point is that you have these discussions wherein you try to define, and you try to think. Listen to this Foucault quotations from one of his many books. It was called Madness and Civilization. People know what they do. Now you could challenge this, mental health issues and so on, but people know what they do. Frequently, they know why they do what they do. I might challenge that. People know what they do. Frequently, they know why they do what they do, but what they don't know is what they do does.
Yes.
That's why I like Foucault.
Yes. No, that's great. And this is something that we talk about all the time, and especially when we're discussing consciousness, and the ghost in the machine and these sorts of things, right? Is that we have this illusion, right, that we are in complete control. Right? Yeah. But then all the time we're doing things, and especially in the United States, right? What's probably the biggest epidemic in the United States? Stress, right? And so the stress response, and you think about how that affects every part of your life. All of a sudden my blood pressure is raised. I have this fight or flight response. I'm experiencing all of these things that aren't real. It's just a perceived threat.
And
right?
Stress itself is a sign of something greater. The Surgeon General just released this week the overall it's as dangerous as the pandemic. Loneliness, which leads to stress, heart disease, isolation, and they're trying to figure out, so how do we rebuild conviviality? How do we rebuild civility at a time when civility is still being severely undermined by intensive rhetoric? It's killing us.
Yeah.
And that's not an overstatement.
Yeah, and there's other research that's coming out, right? And this is just to demonstrate the complexity of humanity, right? That not all solitude is loneliness, right? Because when this, I think we talked about in our episode on aging, right? Where everybody's concerned. We have this view of old people as being almost like children, right? That we need to take care of. And the number one thing is, well, they can't be lonely, right? We have to have people for them and stuff. But what they found is in many cases, a lot of older people preferred solitude, and they were actually able to organize their thoughts better and have more meaningful time being alone than younger people were. And a lot of them found that they didn't have enough time by themselves. And of course, that's, this is a study examining a lot of people. That's what the trends indicate. But on an individual level, it's going to vary from person to person.
Of course,
right? I'm somebody who loves solitude, right? I prefer to be by myself the majority of the time. But I know plenty of other people that are the polar opposite, right? So there is no, just blanket statements we can make about any person like that. But getting back to biopolitics, what are some biopolitical issues surrounding identity?
Well, biopolitics itself, when you think about it on a societal level, and this is what Memby talks about. This is where it goes really very easily. When biopolitics becomes an urge to preserve the life of people who are like you, visibly or by immigrational heritage or whatever it happens to be, such that you're willing to excise and dehumanize other populations as long as you are preserved. And so for identity, it's central to biopolitics. There's so many problems with nation states. Nationalism is an idea that is like loneliness, killing the planet. So I know people don't like that either, but so the identity, when you construct an identity for a group of people that doesn't emerge out of lasting appreciation of the diversity of people and the characteristics they bring to the enterprise, and you construct a story that everyone is supposed to be loyal to, and if everybody isn't, then they're on the outside. And you start building more borders, and you start making and dehumanizing people who are trying to come to a place just because, for the same reasons that your ancestors might have. And when you forget that your ancestors were part of a genocidal campaign in one way or another on the very continent, and all those things. And I know that will set people off too, but it's our history. It's what collectively we did from the start. We did remarkable things too. We had remarkable ideas. We built remarkable structures. But if we don't come to terms with that, it's like ignoring an illness that you have.
Yeah, and it's not just our history; it's our future as well. The National Geographic issue I was reading recently was about populations, and it's both a decline and increase, across the globe, because every country is facing a different scenario, right? And the thing that they were saying, they presented two countries, and it was, I want to say it was Nigeria and China, are in opposite boats, right? With China, the population is shrinking, and they said all the factors that went along with that. And then I think it was Uganda. I'm sorry for not getting the country right, but one of these countries had an rapidly increasing population, and they talked about all of the pros and cons that go along with that.
Yeah.
They said the thing that's interesting about the United States population, right, is that the United States population has technically been in decline since the 70s because the birth rate has not exceeded 2.1 births per woman. But due to immigration, the United States population is likely to continue to grow until at least 2053 due to immigration, right? And so if we set up policies that continue to be WASP-centric, right? White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant.
It's not manageable. It's not tenable.
Right, because, very shortly, white people will not be a majority or even because of immigration, right? And so if you set up policies that are geared towards this and you continue to alienate and put people in bad biopolitical positions who are going to be the majority of the country, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? Like we talked about with the birth issue. A lot of immigrants they found, and not even immigrants, but just Black people or Hispanic people, live in areas that don't have access to those high quality doctors. They don't have access to healthy food. They don't have access. They live in these areas that put them at a disadvantage, and that by extension, lowers their lifespan, right? And decreases their opportunity. It is a necropolitics.
This is a necropolitical thing that arises out of biopolitical imperatives. And what you've just hit on is terribly important. I mean, we're just all over the dynamite box today, but it's because this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it, because it's a fascinating, lucid, intelligent, complex thing that we need to come to terms with. If you privilege an imaginary heritage, and by imaginary heritage, I mean, it wasn't so very long ago that people from Ireland were treated the same way as people are at our southern border. Oh, well, people from China, well, we can build railroads with that slave labor essentially, but can't treat them equally. No. Or if you were from, name the place.
Yeah. The street that I live on right now had, back in, 150 years ago, had a Polish bar across the street from an Italian bar, a Polish church across the street from an Italian church, because these people would not interact. Two white people, right? I remember when I was 18, I went to Serbia, right? And I remember walking down the street, and the people that I were with, that I was staying with, said that, they're like, the Serbians and the Hungarians, they hate each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, what do you mean? They're like, well, you see over here, you see how only tall blonde people are walking on this side of the street and only short or dark haired people are walking on this side of the street? So those are Serbians and Hungarians. And you go, well, these people don't, they're both white people, right? So they don't look that much different. That's how imaginary it is, right? It's because that's just the color of your skin.
Right.
Much less any other defining feature.
So if you take that and you roll with it, though, and you say, no, this is how we determine who we are, it isn't tenable. It's going to go away. We know it's going away, no matter how many, no matter what kind of nationalism, Christian nationalism or white supremacy, it's going away.
And so if you look at it at a national level, like we just were, right? So if the white population of the United States is shrinking and the immigrant populations are growing, but certain political views focus on advantaging white populations and continuing to disadvantage any non-white populations, essentially what you're doing is bankrupting the future of the nation.
Yes. Because
in the grand scheme of things, we're all on the same team. Now, if you extrapolate that to the planet, it's the same scenario, right? We're all humans on the same planet trying to survive.
That's what Achille Mbembe is talking about. That's why he was on. I find it fascinating. Been enjoying reading his work, and I was watching an interview on British television with him. And he's from Cameroon, which is a country central in the large continent of Africa, but close to the west coast, but about middle area. And the interviewer said, "So are you just desperately depressed about all this? We're done. The planet is done." And he said, "No, quite the opposite. We have it in our hands to be able to start thinking about populations on a planetary level. We have enough resources that we could share, and people would have enough water. But we have to rethink our entire structures, which is a very difficult thing to do at a very rapid rate of speed." But he said, no. He said Africa is as a continent, all of the countries, all of the vastly different countries on the continent of Africa, we were the source. This is where life came from. We are still here. We are stayers. This is not a grim necessarily posting, basically is what he's saying. But it is, as you said, it is a global playing field. Well, you use the word global, and there's a whole political contingent will say, oh, globalist. Yeah, that's all that's left. It's us and the universe. So, it's, and when we have the means, look at and biopolitics goes all to other things. Water, the source of life. Well, how do you manage water? And do you go as far as saying, no, you can't live in a desert and expect water to be shipped to you when the Colorado River is diminishing? But we don't go that far. Well, you can live wherever you want to. Yeah, but there's going to be a point at which you can't. And governments are going to have to say, nope, we cannot, nor will we offer any support if you're going to move out into a place that doesn't have water.
Yeah.
That's a biopolitical issue. You have to change rules to make sure that the health of the population is maintained. But changing rules means also sometimes changing prioritizations on food kinds, food stuff, and all those other complicated issues.
Yeah, that's the interesting, trope that runs through the book that I'm reading, Power Trip here, is as he takes each chapter is a source of energy, right? And so you have water, you have food, you have wealth, like I was saying, and then he travels through the history of that concept. And what you see is human history, essentially is just this continuous progression of finding an energy source, exploiting it, running up against the boundaries of it, and then discovering something new. And so to go back to what he was saying in this interview, no, just because things look grim right now, it doesn't necessitate a grim outlook. What it necessitates is the view that, hey, listen, this is the history of our species. We've always done this. And we
know this about ourselves.
Right. We've always innovated, and we've always found something new, and we've always gone on. And there are promising technologies out there to do such things. But yeah, I think that the important part is you do have to have a global view on it, and you have to understand what the situation is before you can address the issue.
And you have to rise above. That's what he and before him, Fanon was arguing. You have to rise above. It's like Maslow's hierarchy. You have to rise above the basic level of kill or be killed, which is, we've drawn dangerously, I'd say close. I'd say, well, in some ways we're there. If you go in the wrong place, drive up a driveway, and you get shot for asking a direction, or turning around and not even, that's not happening everywhere all the time, but it's happening more.
Yeah, and it's funny because this comes into another thing that we talked about last week, and there's been some research on, is the myth of the alpha male, right? But combined with the gossip trap in the form of social media, right? So this myth has been around for a long time that humans are pack animals like wolves, and that each human has a station, right? There's the aggressive loner that leads, everybody just sort of falls in line behind, and then it goes down the hierarchy. And so some scientists studied this in people, and they said, okay, well, if that's what you'd expect to see these dominant, assertive, sort of narcissistic people at the top of organizations. They didn't find that at all. What they found is that by and large, the people at the top of organizations are the ones that work best together with other people. The most socially, conscious people are generally the ones that rise to the top. But, you combine that with what we talked about last week with the gossip trap, and how the gossip trap has sort of reemerged in the 21st century in the form of social media and the mass, the masses way of bringing people up and tearing people down based off of qualities that are not necessarily pertinent to what's being done, but just social opinion, right?
Right.
And so now you start to see characters that do embody the quote unquote alpha male properties rising to the top artificially,
Yep.
Because if some of these courts of public opinion didn't exist, they probably would not have the social capital to get to the places that they're getting.
And there was a time not in the so distant past when people would say, that person isn't going to. Here's right on the same topic. This is something from Membe. He's referring to another philosopher, Elias Canetti. Canetti reminds us, the survivor is the one who, having stood in the path of death, let's choose our action movie, having stood in the path of death, having known many deaths, and having been amid the fallen, is still alive. Or, more precisely, the survivor is the one who has taken on a whole pack of enemies and managed not only to escape alive, but to kill his attackers. This is why killing is the lowest form of survival. That's an interesting phrase. Canetti points out that in the logic of survival, each man is the enemy of every other. Even more radically, in the logic of survival, the horror experienced upon seeing death turns into the satisfaction that the dead person is another. It is the death of the other. The other, capital O's physical presence as a corpse, makes the survivor feel unique. And each enemy killed makes the survivor feel more secure.
It's funny because you and I were talking about this off the air after the podcast last week. I was talking about my basic training experience a little bit and about a couple particular characters, how there's phases to basic training. And the first one is red phase, where if one person screws up, everybody gets punished, right? And so what that experience teaches you is that you need to operate as a team. You need to work as a group. Not everybody learns that lesson, period, much less quickly, right? So some people realize right away, I need to act good because if I don't, everybody's going to get punished. But other people, they never understand that. And they just think, you know what, I'm going to keep doing what's best for me. And by doing so, they punish the group and alienate themselves. Those people are the alpha males.
Yes.
The alpha males are those ones that just say, I'm going to do what's best for me, no matter what the situation is. And I'm going to have a stiff upper lip. And I don't care if other people don't like me. This is what I think is best. And people in a group situation with leadership, people end up hating them. And you can draw your own extrapolations to public figures, how that ends up working out.
Sure. I mean, we have this in pop culture all the time. We talk endlessly about pop culture, and I think it's partly it's fun, and partly it's revelatory. It shows us things about ourselves. The Game of Thrones, one of the most acutely intelligent characters in the Game of Thrones is a queen who has fallen. She's in the family that's the good family, so to speak, right? But even she says, everyone but us is the enemy. And you can see that happening in American culture now. And if that's the case, nothing good is going to happen.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
So what are some biopolitical issues surrounding death?
Again, we saw some of this in the pandemic, but even just in beyond what we've already talked about. When do you allocate fewer resources to the maintenance of the elderly? You know, I was reading something the other day. I said, well, if you make it to 65, you got a 50% chance of getting to 85. There's no guarantee of that. It's Dungeons and Dragons dice all the way along, and so you don't sit there and say, "Oh, phew, I've made it." If you do, you're just kidding yourself. But,
right.
But there was a time when that little gem of wisdom, so to speak, that aphorism would not have existed. But now it does. So do you put more and more and more medical resources toward the elderly, or do you reduce the medical resources and direct them toward the young to make sure that the young are going to thrive? And it doesn't have to be a binary opposition, but it's one of the things that biopolitics must continue. I'm reading a science fiction book right now. My wife just finished reading it, and it's totally engaging. And the premise is an alien armada. You never see them. It's just the ships arrive. And in a tropish fashion, first there's just lights, and they're there, and jets are flying back and forth, and everybody's rattling their sabers. But the aliens only use everyone's language through every device that there is. It says, in 30 days, if you want to survive, you must go to your continent of Antarctica. And the rest of the novel is about what happens in the rush to Antarctica, and then how culture develops on that continent decades later. And it's set in the event happens in 2023, so it's but the idea is that the people, all kinds of vessels, the military vessels are dedicated to, there's flights dropping millions of boxes of supplies on Antarctica. There's very few places to land planes there. We know this. There are some science stations there now, but this isn't a huge population. and people going onto the ships, all kinds of rules. So an aircraft carrier, with the captain of the aircraft carrier, or a ship that size, no, I'm sorry, an oil tanker that's been refurbished. Such rules. Nobody over 45, nobody under 10. And what? We've got all, we've got all this body of knowledge and everything. Yes, but you're going to die when you hit that cold anyway. If you're an elderly person, the chances are you're not going to survive very well. Sick people, we already can't take care of them. How are we going to do that? And so, in what seems, the novel's called The Cold People, but that word "cold" applies to many things. Kind of a cold logic, if you want. And those rules aren't uniform to every single vessel that gets to Antarctica, but it tends to be a very similar kind of rule, because there's a cold decision that if you want to have a chance, and you're only going to have, there's like maybe, I think, 1 million people who manage to survive and make it to Antarctica. That's the human population, 1 million from all over the planet. And I won't give other things away. It's just a fascinating book, but biopolitical. Because of people making command decisions about who has an opportunity to survive and who doesn't.
Yeah, and again, it strips it of the individuality, right?
Yeah.
And I always go back to the Army, right? I remember one time there was a special forces recruiter showed up, and he was trying to recruit me. He looked at, oh man, you got a 98 on your ASVAB score, which is, the kind of the intelligence and the job testing. Oh, you've got a 298 on your PT score, the physical test, out of 300. Like, have you ever thought about wanting to be a ranger? And I said, yeah, I've thought about it. And he's like, so, well, here, what are some more details? And then he found out that I was 28, and he said, oh, well, never mind, you're too old. Right? And you go, well, wait a minute. If I'm physically and mentally capable, what does my age have to do with it? And I have very little doubt that I could still be operating at that level today, right? But that it's taken out of the equation because of a single factor, the age, right?
Yep.
So with the elderly, right? Another interesting scenario in the same book or the same National Geographic series, they were talking about elderly people, and they're saying a funny thing happens. Your chances of surviving decrease every year until you get to 94 or 96, and then it levels off. And so they're trying to determine what the maximum age of a person is, right? And they say, that your chances are even after that. But the problem is that it's dropped so much that you have a very low chance of making it to the next year, but you have the same chance that you had the previous year for the rest of whatever your life may be. Is. And like you said, that raises interesting questions, necropolitical questions. And again, we can bring back in the my body, my choice thing, because there's also a lot of states have rules about assisted suicide, right?
Yes.
Some people who have reached the end of life don't want to live anymore. And some of them don't have the choice to not receive life extending medical care.
That's right.
So, you have, there's two sides to that coin, where you say some people want to die and they're not allowed to, and some people want to live, but they don't have access to the resources.
Yes. And so how you determine, I mean, I'm not advocating Bernie Sanders in saying this, but he put into the mix an alternative model for the United States that is, in fact, used in some other places, and not perfectly, but used, that would radically alter medical access on one level, as long as you could get the medical practitioners on another. I have a future daughter-in-law who I just think of the world of, and is working on becoming a medical doctor. And she cares about people, and she's highly intelligent, and I was going to become an incredible doctor. But also knows that she could go anywhere, because there's such need all around this country, let alone other places, because there aren't enough doctors. even for the population we have, as the population diminishes and as we become more gerontological. And so how do you deal with it? That's the biopolitical, philosophical set of questions that had to be asked over and over and over again as policies shift and adjust and evolve.
Yeah, and a big part of that biopolitical coin is preventative medicine, right? And this is part of what Michel Foucault is talking about.
Yep.
Is, if we can just provide people with healthy food, if we can just encourage people to exercise, if we can just get people, to sleep on a good schedule by not overworking them and not overstressing them and doing these things, then that would decrease billions of dollars of medical expenses and some of the need that we have for this palliative and prescriptive care.
It certainly would. It certainly would, as would making some things required on insurance that aren't now. Dental care is enormously not on insurance care for so many people. And we know the medical world has made absolutely clear that dental care is the first chief determinant of longevity. But we don't cover it.
Yeah.
So that's a biopolitical decision. And so the question has to be asked, why isn't it covered? Why isn't it privileged? What happens? In the state in which we live, which I love to live in, and which I won't, it's not a perfect state here, but I like it. It has a lot of things. People grouse, but in this state, discussions of a budget, there was a biopolitical decision that I find enormously important. And that is for creative arts therapists, insurance is encouraged to cover certain kinds of creative arts therapy. But because dance movement therapy did not have its own lobbyist to speak for it, it was the one creative arts therapy that got excised from the budget this year. This is a therapy I know firsthand because my second born is practicing going into this. I've seen reports of how it works for people. But because there wasn't a lobbyist to yell loudly enough, even though it's part of creative arts therapy, it isn't covered this year. So there's going to be a lot of push to bring it back. But that was a biopolitical decision. We won't cover this kind of therapy. Why? Well, we got to save money somewhere. Oh, so we'll cover this, and this, but not that, because we got to save money. But you're not determining how much help that could be. That's what this stuff is about.
Yeah, and that brings us back to another important part of doing philosophy like we do, which is the categorization, right? And this idea that just using terms and definitions and these sorts of things creates an artificial sort of air about it. A big one, right, is being in nature, right? Being in nature reduces people's stress and stuff. But how do you prescribe that, right? You have to redevelop your public spaces. My wife works for our little local government, and they're working on they've actually been recognized as a tree-friendly town, right?
Yes.
So they're planting trees all over the town. Mm-hmm. That's part of it, right? Introducing nature into urban areas and making rural areas accessible to people, and they know that from scientific studies that just being in nature is good for your health, right? But you try to put that into a political term, it becomes messy. So what is the proper role of government in biopolitical issues?
To keep engaging its population, whether the population wants to be engaged or not. And that doesn't mean telling the population in all cases what it absolutely must do, because that would be antithetical to the idea of conversation. But the conversation has to be engaged, and it has to be a real one, not just a pretend tossing of slogans back and forth. That's the job of the government, is to be just like Socrates, a gadfly, nit, poking at you, because bringing up things you don't want to think about, bringing up things you don't want to hear, because there's a responsibility beyond one's individual family or oneself. That's back to the idea of utilitarianism. It's back to the idea of there's a relationship. If you go back to nature all by yourself, fine. You can go be a survivalist. You might find others who are akin to you, and you'll find your own group. But back to nature in an extreme, like all extremes, probably isn't the best thing for a whole lot of people. But being in nature and engaging with it, such as our autism nature trail in Letchworth Park or something like that, absolutely vital. But then even with the thing you just described, because I live in the community next door, and because of this community's tree initiative, ours is starting to blossom, to use a bad pun, to take root. Anyway, but the pushback, of course, is what you'd expect. People saying, you can't take my right to take down my own trees. If I don't want trees around my place, then I'll take them down. You can't tell me to keep my trees. Okay. But you can't tell other people whether or not they can do things with their bodies, and you can't tell other people because they aren't like you that they can't survive. You can't throw out you can't.
Yeah.
It's back to the Foucault thing. What does happen because of the positions you take? So even things on the level of planting a tree become so controversial.
Yeah. And she's seen that where, they asked everybody. First, they went out and they did an assessment. They tried to identify locations where it would be good to plant trees, where trees would do some good and trees would thrive. Mm-hmm. Then they sent out letters to all the people that live at those places and said, would you like a tree? And sure enough, some people said no, but the majority said yes, right? And by doing that, there's multiple benefits, right? And I think that is what government is about, right? Just the role of government in biopolitical issues is looking at the big picture and then making decisions that are the best for the society as a whole, right? And so with planting trees, not only are you, improving people's mental health by increasing their access to nature in their urban environments, but you're also helping out the planet. They found that if you have trees on the side of the road where many of these trees are being planted and it shades the road, you're preventing heat from being absorbed by that blacktop. And, and the trees are storing carbon. They're doing multiple different things that are improving the health of the planet and the health of the population. And this goes back to what we were talking about with racial policies, right? And how if, some of the best policies for fixing the nation's problems aren't the ones that you would think. There are things that are much more basic, like providing access to food in food deserts, providing healthcare, not discriminating based off of racial attributes and
leaving some things. Green spaces green and developing the green spaces everywhere, not just in privileged locations. Yeah,
right. Because that's a great example, right? You can exploit all of your oil and cut down all your timber, and your economy will be through the roof, and that's great. But guess what? Pretty soon you run out of those things, and the country's bankrupt. If you only cater to a certain population and that population's shrinking, eventually the country is bankrupt, right? So these biopolitical issues, I think that the role of government in them is looking at the big picture and deciding what's best for the people in its country. And again, the people on the entire planet. If you have things that are causing planetary problems, those should be a primary concern of government bodies.
And government that listens to its people often can make it's also slow, right? Seemingly slow. But when a majority of people say X and the representatives say, la, 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 we have our own agenda, thank you very much, go away, that's when it falls apart.
Yep. Yeah, so I thought this was a really fun and interesting conversation. Yeah. I don't think it got too grim.
Well, I hope not.
And I'm sure that it's gonna play a role in future conversations as well. But until next time, keep on.